We move over to chapter 13 now to really kind of try to understand the issue of the business model of the media. And so, economics and mass media, this chapter hopefully goes along with helping us just to oversee the general idea of the way the media and society operate. So, we're trying to look at characteristics of media industries, think about the internet's effects, think about what we call the information economy, what's going on with globalization, and then ultimately culture and economics issues with the mass media and society. So think about these three different types of ways that business can operate. You could have a monopoly where one entity controls a product or service. You can have an oligopoly where a few companies control a product or service. You can have monopolistic competition, and that's a case where an industry in which many firms offer products or services that are similar, but they're not perfect substitutes. So these are all in contrast to an open economic system where you have true competition. These would be three other kinds of characteristics you can have besides true competition. Revenue, of course, companies have to make money to operate. In the United States, we run things based on capitalism. And so when we have a job, we get paid. When we run a company, we're doing it for profit. And so companies make money either from the consumers or from advertising. Book publishers on one end, TV networks on the other. No matter what, it's a matter of where does the revenue come from. Print newspapers have a high first copy cost and lower marginal cost. They have a high overhead within the editorial content. And then, of course, printing the paper. But how do they make their money? From selling the paper? Well, they make their money more from the advertising. And of course, that model is changing so that more and more of what news organizations do, whether it's broadcast or print, is based on making the money from their online version. From large media conglomerates, control, that's one part of where the revenue is. Most of the TV network control and stations are owned by these large media companies. One company usually dominates a local cable provider market, like Spectrum in commerce. Radio is heavily consolidated. A handful of companies own the majority of the major market stations. Clear Channel became iHeartMedia, and then you have companies like them that own a large number of stations per market, and then a large number of stations across the country. The big four music companies, as discussed in our book, are now the big three. They dominate the music industry. They're closely linked with radio because of the importance of radio to some degree still in promoting the artists that the record companies have contract with. Ticketmaster and Live Nation merged, basically performing the same service. And then large companies overall also dominate the movie market. In the internet's effects, online space is much more inexpensive than print or broadcast media. So most newspapers now allow free online access, but many use paywalls. They charge for some content or they charge you after a certain number of page views. There's a synergy of what's going on, this combination of media outlets across platforms, such as newspapers producing video or TV networks producing text stories for internet pages, and advertising targeting. And the models for doing that are changing. Instead of buying time on the traditional media, the advertisers increasingly buy time on streaming services and targeted through internet distribution. Google is a big player in that. Google has text ads that come up next to the search results on web pages targeting specific web visitors. And of course, there is a tracking that goes on with everything you do. And all of those codes that are part of the pages show up and then point advertising toward you that's targeted towards some of the searches that you've done. There's a cost barrier that's been created because of web-based advertising. People can afford to pay pennies per ad in order to reach a certain targeted group of people. And the bulk of Google's revenue comes from advertising income. Google News is another of their services, some controversy in what they do because they aggregate from other sources, link those together as news stories. And so ultimately there are critics, and a lot of the critics include the companies whose work they aggregate and make money from aggregating. And so there's kind of the sense of them infringing on what these other companies own. There's the issue of file sharing, of course, and the fact that we can share digital files of audio and video content, streaming of music and video effects sales in those categories. And there's concern from the companies that they lose a lot of revenue by people getting free access. Some of that has been addressed by some regulation. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, for example, is the 1998 law that was an effort to stop illegal copying and distribution of copyrighted material. And so copyright holders can send notices over the use of their material. So if you post something on YouTube, for example, that has a popular song with some visuals added to it, they can take it down and they can do things that ultimately retain control of their copyright, including having YouTube take away your account with them over infringement problems that you continue to do. So then we get into the digital divide. The digital divide is about the haves and the have-nots. So all the issue is about this chapter is the economic factors, people paying for services or advertisers paying for access to your attention so they can sell you products. But we have the people without access to the internet, and this is low-income people, whether it's in the US or it's low-income countries around the world. So the digital divide can be a barrier for workers, particularly older ones in a job market. We say that, for example, there's the bottom billion of 6.8 billion people in the world, only 1.6 billion are connected to the internet. And then it's, again, an issue overall of economic status and age issues. There also has been this one laptop per child program based on the digital divide, and that was an effort by Nicholas Negroponte and others through a connection to MIT that tried to put low-cost laptops into the hands of children in low-income areas, especially in other countries. That program essentially failed. It did not accomplish what they were trying to do, and at some level, it's still kind of around, but it really has faded in recent years. Otherwise, legislation, there is the Federal Communications Commission that regulates the information economy and businesses to some degree that are involved in media. They have the regulatory authority with the 5-member commission. There's also, of course, antitrust legislation that can be used by the government. This comes from the Department of Justice that can be used to encourage competition. And going back to the kind of Congress and the FCC, there was the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that was intended to open up competition among more companies, but what it ultimately did is solidified the trend of deregulation and consolidation that had been happening from the 1980s. The book talks about vertical integration, so we try to appreciate within the economic side that media companies produce and distribute content. And so if I am the producer of content, how do I get that distributed? Notice these days we've got the primary kinds of streaming services like Netflix and Hulu, but we have more and more of these media companies starting their own separate streaming services. Now, Disney controls Hulu now. They didn't have the control at the beginning, but they do now. Disney started Disney Plus. And then, of course, a company like CBS is trying to have their own individual streaming services. That has to do with media that they create, and then whether or not they can also distribute that content or have a distribution outlet. So Disney is this conglomerate that manages theme parks and movie studios and runs ESPN and ABC, bought much of what was the old Fox company and has control of that properties that were owned by the studio. And there's a synergy there that creates opportunities, but then there are also political, ethical, and then at some level legal concerns that occur when these companies get too much power. With digital files, there is a digital rights management protection code within digital materials that limits use of files or controls copying. So there are technology things that are in place that try to help control the illegal use of digital materials. But for any technology, people can find ways to bypass that. And so piracy remains an issue, piracy being at the simplest way of definition, the illegal copying of digital materials. Digital music sales advanced gracefully over a period like from 2004 to 2008. But then when we started getting into the digital age, there was a big impact. So that 187 million in 2004 became 1.8 billion in 2008. But in digital files impact in 2019, the revenue from digital album downloads amounted to 394.5 million US dollars. That was less than half the figure recorded in 2016. Now, it doesn't mean people are doing piracy, pirating copies, and file sharing is the impact. A lot of this is because of people using streaming services, Pandora, Spotify, and so forth. But it is attributed by the music industry and the movie industry of being a reason that their revenues are down. Subscription and streaming revenues have been increasing annually and reached $8.83 billion in 2019, making up the vast majority of revenues for the entire music industry. Globalization, of course, is an issue within economics. Not all countries are on a capitalism-based system, but we still have a worldwide economy that has an impact within the way things happen. COVID-19 had a clear global economic impact on all kinds of economic structures, and media are a cultural product, and within globalization, there's an economic benefit. But then we also get into that idea of cultural imperialism, and the spread of culture across borders is a concern. It can lead to homogenization, that people all kind of start buying into one particular way of life and view of the world. And so within the sense of global markets, the media companies very clearly now tailor content to global markets. And the chapter talks about Titanic, the movie, about how that was done as a way to get a lot of US profits, but then also profit internationally. So again, cultural imperialism is that concern at one level when we start dealing with the spread of media content. It describes the US's role as an influential cultural superpower. The chapter also talks in a similar way about McDonaldization, the efficiency, the calculability, the predictability, the control, kind of the operation of that type of business and it spreading around the world. And again, we're thinking about the fact that a lot of what we're talking about with media is it's a business. And when people run media entities, whatever it is, a radio station, it's a podcast, it's a movie making industry, you're making money from whatever cultural elements you can develop that people have an interest in, and therefore they will pay for, or they will have access to it, and advertisers will pay to reach those customers, and you make the money that way. Let's do a little bit of review then over this chapter of the three basic media business models. Which one is probably the most familiar? It occurs when one entity controls a product or service, such as when a small town has only one major newspaper. Instead of competition, you've got a monopoly. Which of the three basic media business models, other than complete competition, has a case that takes place when multiple companies offer essentially the same product or service, but they're not quite perfect substitutes for each other? That's what we call monopolistic competition. Applied to media businesses in general, companies employ many different ways to raise revenue for their services, but all boil down to two fundamental ideas. Where does the money come from? It either comes from consumers, and in newspapers, as an example, we call that a paywall. If I want to get Netflix, I pay for that. Don't have to worry about advertising. Or the business makes money from selling advertising. Results that come up naturally from a search on Google are called organic search results. But when we have what else do we have where marketers are matching advertisers with particular keywords on particular web pages, such as if the search is a how-to guide for fixing a refrigerator and the advertiser's services fit that search? Well, in that case, we have people doing targeted ads. So we don't get organic search results, we get ones that come up because of having been paid for. In 1998, what was it that Congress enacted that was an effort to stop the illegal copying and distribution of copyrighted material? That's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. What is it that's related to the digital divide? The issue is that the internet, created in large part by and for the rich, is practically useless for the poor, particularly in developing countries. So we have the issue of the digital divide. Then related to that, we have what's called the 80-20 effect. In addressing the digital divide, although the venture ultimately failed, what project tried to make literally hundreds of millions of low-cost laptops available to children around the world? That was the one laptop per child project. What's the modern theory that was expressed in the 1998 publication of Information Rules, a strategic guide to the network economy, where their fundamental argument was simple: technology changes, economic laws do not. So chapter 13 tells us about the information economy. Chapter 13 says the consequences of monopolization by one media company could be alarming because distributed information can influence public policy and public opinion. Those in charge of the government have an interest in ensuring fair distribution of information. We don't necessarily get it, but the goal is that the Federal Communications Commission is responsible for regulating the media and trying to control too much control by big media companies. Following widespread deregulation of the media during the 1980s, companies became increasingly conglomerated, and corporations at the time, such as Comcast and Time Warner, came to dominate the marketplace. What was the act that helped to actually solidify this trend? It was touted as a way to let any communications business compete in any market against any other and to foster competition, but the act in practice actually sped up conglomeration of the media. That is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. The music industry has wasted no amount of firepower to blame what for the decline in album sales, saying there's no minimizing the impact of illegal file sharing, and they're talking about piracy, illegal copies of digital material. As globalization takes hold and a particular community becomes more like the US economically, this community may also come to adopt and personalize US cultural values. And the concern is that the outcome of this spread can be the homogenization. And that's where the local culture becomes more like the culture of the US. Antonio Gramsci originated the idea of what to describe the power of one group over another. We use the term in general to refer to negotiating a preferred position over any particular cultural value. So chapter 13 helps us to appreciate what's called cultural hegemony. So other review then, besides just what we've tried to talk about here and a little bit of review in the PowerPoint, always go to the end of the chapter. There is an assessment there that lists major chapter content to help you kind of pay attention to the major terms.